In 1976, two young friends, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, started a company called Apple. They didn't have a huge office, they didn't have millions of dollars. They worked from a small garage. Their dream was simple: to make computers accessible to ordinary people. Most experts believed computers would remain expensive machines used only by businesses and scientists. But Jobs and Wozniak saw a different future. They believed every home would someday have a computer. Few people believed them, but they started building anyway. The garage was small. There were no luxury desks, no expensive equipment, no large team of engineers. Just a handful of tools, electronic components, and two young men with an idea that sounded impossible. During the day, they searched for parts. At night, they assembled circuit boards by hand. The work was slow, the money was limited, every dollar mattered. Sometimes they worried about how they would pay for the next batch of components. Sometimes they wondered whether anyone would even buy their product. Friends and family often questioned their decision. Many people couldn't understand why anyone would want a computer at home. Computers were huge, expensive, complicated. Most people had never touched one. The idea of a personal computer seemed unrealistic, but Steve Jobs refused to stop believing. He often spoke about a future that nobody else could see. A future where computers would help people learn, create, communicate, and work. A future where technology would not belong only to large corporations. It would belong to everyone. Steve Wozniak focused on making that vision possible. He spent countless hours designing circuits and improving hardware. He loved engineering. He wanted to build a computer that was powerful, affordable, and easy to use. Together, they made an unusual team. Jobs was the dreamer. Wozniak was the builder. One imagined the future, the other turned it into reality. The early days were difficult. There were moments of doubt, moments of frustration, moments when failure seemed more likely than success. To raise money, they sold personal belongings. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his scientific calculator. Neither received much money, but it was enough to keep the dream alive a little longer. Every order mattered, every customer mattered. The company's future depended on those first sales. Then something unexpected happened. A local computer store became interested in their product. The store wanted dozens of computers. For Apple, the order felt enormous. It was an opportunity, but it was also a problem. They needed parts. They needed money. They needed to build far more computers than ever before. The risk was huge. If they failed, the company might disappear before it truly began. Yet they accepted the challenge. Night after night, the garage remained full of activity. Circuit boards covered tables, boxes of components filled corners. The founders worked until exhaustion. Sometimes they barely slept. Sometimes they worked through entire weekends. But little by little, Apple began to grow. The first customers were impressed. More orders followed. More people started hearing about the young company. The impossible dream no longer seemed completely impossible. One evening, after another long day of work, Steve Jobs stood outside the garage and looked at the building. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't famous, it wasn't worth millions of dollars. But inside that small garage was an idea powerful enough to change the world. At the time, nobody knew it, not the customers, not the investors, not the experts, not even the founders themselves. They couldn't imagine that one day Apple would become one of the most valuable companies in history. They couldn't imagine products used by billions of people. They couldn't imagine changing entire industries. In 1976, there was only a garage, a dream, and two friends willing to risk everything for it. The journey had just begun. Apple launched the Apple I. The computer became a huge success. Sales exploded, revenue grew rapidly, investors became interested. The small garage startup suddenly became one of the fastest growing companies in America. Steve Jobs was only in his 20s, yet Apple was already worth millions of dollars. The dream was becoming reality. For the first time, Apple had a product that people truly wanted. The Apple I was different from many computers of its time. It was designed for ordinary people, not just engineers and large corporations. It was easier to use, more practical, and far more appealing to everyday customers. Families bought it, schools bought it, small businesses bought it. Demand continued growing month after month. Inside Apple, excitement filled the air. Only a short time earlier, the company had been operating from a small garage. Now orders were arriving from across the country. Employees worked tirelessly to keep up. Production increased. New staff were hired. The company moved into larger offices. Everything was happening faster than anyone expected. Steve Jobs pushed the team constantly. He demanded excellence. He believed great products could change people as slaves. Many employees found his standards difficult, but they also recognized his passion. He wanted Apple to create products that were not merely functional. He wanted them to be revolutionary. As sales increased, investors began paying attention. The young startup that many had ignored was now impossible to overlook. Venture capital firms saw opportunity. Business magazines published articles about Apple. Technology experts started discussing the company. For the first time, Apple was becoming known beyond the small world of computer enthusiasts. Money began flowing into the business. Revenue climbed from thousands of dollars to millions, then even more. Each financial report seemed more impressive than the last. Employees who had joined during the early garage days watched in amazement. The company was growing before their eyes. One afternoon, Steve Jobs looked at the latest sales figures. The numbers were extraordinary, far beyond what he had imagined only a few years earlier. Yet instead of celebrating, he focused on the future. Success had given Apple something valuable, a chance to dream even bigger. Jobs believed computers would eventually become a part of everyday life. Not just in offices, not just in schools, everywhere. Many people still doubted that vision, but every Apple he sold was proof that the world was changing. Customers wrote letters describing how the computer helped them learn, work, and create. Teachers used it in classrooms. Entrepreneurs used it to run businesses. Students used it to explore technology for the first time. Apple wasn't simply selling machines, it was helping shape the future of personal computing. The company, as growth became extraordinary, revenue increased year after year, the workforce expanded rapidly. New products were discussed, new opportunities appeared, competitors began paying attention. Some admired Apple, others feared it, because it was becoming clear that Apple was no longer just another startup. It was becoming a serious force in technology. Then came another major milestone. Apple prepared to go public. The public offering attracted enormous attention. When Apple shares became available, investors rushed to buy them. The event created instant millionaires inside the company. Steve Jobs, still in his 20s, suddenly became one of the most famous young entrepreneurs in America. Newspapers celebrated his success. Television networks requested interviews. Business leaders wanted to meet him. To many people, Steve Jobs looked like the perfect success story. A young dreamer who had built a fortune from a garage, but behind the headlines, pressure was growing. Expectations were rising. Competition was increasing. The technology industry was changing rapidly. Apple had achieved remarkable success. Yet maintaining success would prove even harder than achieving it. The company had conquered its first challenge. Now an even greater challenge awaited. How do you continue changing the world after your first big victory? For Apple, the answer would lead to both incredible triumphs and painful setbacks. And the most dramatic chapter of Steve Jobs' life was still ahead. Success did not last forever. Internal conflicts grew. Projects failed. Competition increased. In 1985, something shocking happened. Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple. The company he helped create no longer wanted him. Many people thought his career was over. Losing Apple was one of the most painful moments of his life. But the story was not finished. By the early 1980s, Apple had become one of the most successful technology companies in America. The company was growing rapidly. Thousands of employees worked for Apple. Millions of computers had been sold. Investors were happy. Customers loved the brand. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But inside the company, problems were growing. As Apple became larger, disagreements became more common. Executives argued about strategy. Managers disagreed about products. Pressure increased every year. Steve Jobs remained passionate and demanding. He expected perfection. He pushed employees to work harder. Some admired him. others found him difficult to work with. Meanwhile, competition was becoming stronger. New computer companies entered the market. One of the biggest threats came from IBM, whose computers were becoming increasingly popular. Apple needed another breakthrough. The company believed the answer was a new product called the Macintosh. Jobs poured his energy into the project. He wanted to create a computer unlike anything the world had seen before. The Macintosh eventually launched and attracted enormous attention. Its design was revolutionary. Its graphical interface felt futuristic. But despite the excitement, Apple continued facing challenges. Sales did not always meet expectations. Financial pressure increased. Arguments inside the company became more serious. The board of directors began questioning Jobs' leadership. Meetings became tense. Relationships deteriorated. The situation grew worse month after month. Then came the moment nobody expected. In 1985, after power struggle inside Apple, Steve Jobs lost control. The board sided with other executives. The company he had helped build from a garage was moving on without him. Jobs was only 30 years old, yet suddenly he found himself without a place at Apple. The news shocked Silicon Valley, it shocked employees, it shocked investors. Most of all, it shocked Steve Jobs himself. Years of work, years of sacrifice, years of building Apple. And now he was gone. Later, Jobs would describe it as feeling like a public failure. For months, he struggled emotionally. He felt lost, embarrassed, heartbroken. Many people believed his career was finished. Newspapers questioned his future. Critics claimed Apple had succeeded despite him, not because of him. Some said he would never recover. For the first time in years, Jobs had no clear direction. One evening, he sat alone thinking about everything he had lost. The company, his position, his dream, the future he had imagined. It felt as if his entire life had collapsed. But something important happened during that difficult period. Instead of giving up, Steve Jobs began thinking about what came next. He realized that although he had lost Apple, he had not lost his passion. He still loved technology. He still loved creating products. He still believed he could build something extraordinary. Years later, Jobs would say that being fired from Apple was one of the best things that ever happened to him at the time. However, it felt like a disaster. The world saw failure. Jobs saw pain. But hidden inside that painful moment was the beginning of an even greater comeback. Because sometimes the end of one chapter becomes the beginning of another, and Steve Jobs' greatest achievements were still ahead of him. After leaving Apple, Steve Jobs faced one of the most difficult periods of his life. The company he had helped build was gone from his daily life. The media called him a failure. Many investors doubted him. Some people believed he would never create another successful company. For the first time in years, Jobs had no clear direction. He was only 30 years old, yet he felt as if everything he had worked for had been taken away. For several months, he struggled with disappointment. Friends noticed that he was quieter than before. The future seemed uncertain. But deep inside, Jobs still loved technology. He still loved creating products. And he wasn't ready to quit. Instead of retiring, he decided to start over. In 1985, he founded a new company called Next. The goal was ambitious. Jobs wanted to build powerful computers for universities, researchers, and professionals. Just like Apple in its early days, Next started with a small team and a big vision. The company attracted talented engineers from across the technology industry. Jobs demanded excellence. Every detail mattered: the design, the software, the hardware. Nothing was allowed to be average. The team worked tirelessly. Years were spent developing the first Next computer. Millions of dollars were invested. Expectations were high. When the product finally launched, it impressed many experts. The machine was elegant, advanced, years ahead of its time. But there was a problem. It was expensive, too expensive for many customers. Sales remained limited. Next became respected for its technology, but it did not become a major commercial success. To outsiders, it looked like Jobs had failed again, but something important was happening. The software created by Next was incredibly powerful. Many engineers admired it, and years later, that software would play a critical role in Apple's future. While building Next, another unexpected opportunity appeared. Jobs purchased a small computer graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas. At the time, few people paid attention. The company was small. It wasn't making much money. Many believed it had little value. Jobs renamed it Pixar. For years, Pixar struggled financially. The company lost money. Projects were delayed. Investors showed little interest. Several times, Jobs personally used his own money to keep Pixar alive. Some advisors told him to sell it. Others suggested shutting it down completely. But Jobs believed in the team as talent. He believed computer animation could become something extraordinary. Years passed, the risk continued. Then everything changed. Pixar partnered with Disney to create a fully computer-animated movie. The project was called Toy Story. Many people thought the idea was impossible. No major studio had ever released a full-length computer-animated feature film. The stakes were enormous. If the movie failed, Pixar's future would be uncertain. If it succeeded, it could change animation forever. In 1995, Toy Story was released. The result shocked Hollywood. Audiences loved it, critics praised it. The film became a massive success. Box office revenue soared. Pixar suddenly became one of the most exciting companies in entertainment. The company that had struggled for years was now making history. More successful films followed. A Bug-Ass Life, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo. Each success increased Pixar's value. Steve Jobs, once viewed as a failed entrepreneur, was becoming successful again. But the biggest surprise was still ahead. While Jobs was rebuilding his career through Next and Pixar, Apple was facing serious problems. Sales were slowing, competition was increasing. The company that had once forced Jobs out was now struggling. And soon, Apple would make a decision that nobody expected. The company would call Steve Jobs and ask him to come back. The comeback was about to begin. By the mid-1990s, Apple was in serious trouble. The company that had once revolutionized personal computing was losing its direction. Sales were slowing, profits were shrinking, competitors were growing stronger. Many customers were choosing computers running Microsoft as software instead. Inside Apple, confusion spread to many products, to many strategies, to many problems. Some analysts even predicted that Apple might not survive. The company that had once been one of the most exciting businesses in America was now fighting for its future. Ironically, the solution was the very person Apple had pushed away years earlier. In 1996, Apple made a surprising decision. The company agreed to buy Next. Officially, Apple wanted Next as advanced software technology. But the deal brought something else back as well: Steve Jobs. When Jobs walked through Apple's offices again, many employees were shocked. Some remembered the passionate founder from years earlier. Others knew him only through stories. At first, Jobs returned as an advisor, but as Apple's problems grew worse, his influence increased. The company was losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Morale was low. Investors were nervous. Customers were uncertain. Apple needed leadership. It needed a vision. And soon, Steve Jobs was back in charge. The situation he inherited was difficult. Apple had too many products. Many were confusing. Some barely sold at all. The company was spending money without a clear plan. Jobs believed Apple had lost focus. One of his first actions was dramatic. He cancelled dozens of projects. Many employees were surprised. Some were angry. Others feared for their jobs. But Jobs believed Apple needed simplicity. Instead of trying to do everything, the company needed to do a few things exceptionally well. He reduced the product lineup, focused resources, simplified decision-making, and demanded excellence once again. The pressure inside Apple increased. Employees worked harder, expectations rose. The future of the company depended on the decisions being made during those years. Then Jobs made another controversial move. In 1997, he announced a partnership with Microsoft. Many Apple fans were shocked. Microsoft had long been viewed as Apple's biggest rival. Some people even booed when the partnership was announced. But Jobs looked beyond emotions. Apple needed stability. It needed support, and he was willing to make difficult decisions to save the company. Slowly, signs of recovery began appearing. Customers returned. Confidence improved. the company as finances stabilized. But Jobs knew survival wasn't enough. Apple needed something extraordinary. It needed a product that would remind the world why the company mattered. That product arrived in 1998. The colorful, futuristic-looking iMac immediately captured attention. Unlike most computers at the time, it looked fun, modern, different. Sales surged. Customers loved it. For the first time in years, Apple felt exciting again. The company was no longer simply surviving, it was growing. Investors noticed, customers noticed, the media noticed, the comeback had begun. But Steve Jobs wasn't finished. He believed computers were only the beginning. He imagined a future where technology would fit into people's pockets. A future where phones, music, and the internet would come together in a single device. Many people considered the idea unrealistic, others thought it was impossible. Yet Jobs had spent his entire career pursuing ideas that seemed impossible. And soon, Apple would introduce products that would transform entire industries. The return of Steve Jobs had saved Apple, but his greatest achievements were still ahead. The world was about to meet the iPod, then the iPhone, and nothing would ever be the same again. By the early 2000s, Apple had recovered, the company was profitable again. Customers were excited about its products, investors had regained confidence. Many people believed Apple's comeback story was complete, but Steve Jobs thought differently. He wasn't interested in simply saving Apple. He wanted to reinvent the future once again. In 2001, Apple introduced the iPod. The small music player looked simple, but it changed how people listened to music. Thousands of songs could fit inside a pocket. For millions of customers, it felt revolutionary. Sales exploded. The iPod became one of the most successful consumer electronics products in history. Apple's popularity continued growing, but Jobs was already focused on the next challenge. He believed that mobile phones would eventually replace many devices people carried every day. Phones, music players, cameras, internet devices. He imagined combining them into a single product. Most experts thought the idea was too ambitious. Mobile phones at the time were limited and difficult to use. Many technology companies were struggling to improve them. Yet Jobs believed Apple could do something different. For years, engineers worked in secrecy. Small teams developed prototypes. Designers tested countless ideas. The pressure was enormous. The project consumed millions of dollars. Failure would be extremely expensive, but Jobs pushed forward. Then came January 9, 2007. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco. The audience expected an important announcement. What happened next became one of the most famous product presentations in history. Jobs smiled and said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." The crowd cheered. Then he revealed the first iPhone. A phone, an iPod, an internet communicator, all in one device. The audience erupted with excitement. Many people immediately realized they were witnessing history. The iPhone wasn't just another product. It represented a completely new way of interacting with technology. Touch screens replaced physical keyboards, apps opened endless possibilities. The internet became accessible from almost anywhere. When the iPhone launched, demand was extraordinary. Stores filled with customers, lines stretched around buildings, people waited for hours, sometimes overnight, to buy Apple's newest device. Sales skyrocketed. Year after year, the iPhone became more successful. Competitors rushed to copy its features. Entire industries changed. Smartphones transformed communication, photography, entertainment, business, education, navigation, and daily life itself. The iPhone became one of the most successful products ever created. Apple's value soared, revenue reached record levels. The company grew into one of the largest businesses in the world. Steve Jobs had achieved what many considered impossible, not once, but multiple times. Yet while Apple was reaching new heights, Jobs was facing a private battle. In 2004, he was diagnosed with cancer. For years, he continued leading Apple while undergoing treatment. Most customers never saw the full extent of his struggle. He continued working, continued presenting products, continued pushing Apple forward. Despite enormous personal challenges, as his health declined, the world watched with concern. People admired his resilience, his dedication, his refusal to stop creating. Then, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. The news shocked the world. Millions of people mourned. Tributes appeared across countries and cultures. Business leaders, engineers, artists, students, entrepreneurs, people who had never met him felt the impact of his work. Because Steve Jobs had done more than build products, he had changed how people interacted with technology. He had transformed multiple industries: computers, music, phones, animation, digital media. His influence reached billions of lives. Years later, students still study his journey, entrepreneurs still quote his speeches, innovators still draw inspiration from his ideas. One of his most famous messages remains relevant today: the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Apple's story began in a small garage. To friends, limited money, a dream that seemed impossible. Along the way came success, failure, loss, comebacks, innovation, and ultimately, a legacy that changed the world. Steve Jobs' journey proves that success is not a straight line. It is filled with setbacks, risks, and uncertainty, but those who continue moving forward, even after failure, can achieve extraordinary things. From a garage in California to one of the most valuable companies in history, from a young dreamer to a global icon, Steve Jobs' story remains one of the greatest entrepreneurial journeys ever told. And decades later, his vision continues to shape the future.